Hello and welcome to the Week in Politics with Michelle Grattan. I'm Caroline Fisher, Assistant Professor of Journalism at the University of Canberra. Hello Michelle, how are you?
Hi Caroline.
So Parliament returned this week and we saw a lot of debate and division around the impact of the coronavirus on issues like the Black Lives Matter protests and ongoing debate about whether or not state borders should be reopened. Firstly, let's look at the Black Lives Matter protests. I mean, thousands of Australians across the nation did join protests against the treatment of First Nations Australians by the police and the justice system. It's proving, though, to be quite a divisive issue in relation to the management of coronavirus restrictions and social distancing, etc. How should the Prime Minister be managing this?
Well, I think he's finding it quite hard to manage, and he's showing his frustration because the thing is, while as we speak there's only been one case diagnosed in a protester and that person wouldn't have got it at the rally, nevertheless it will take a couple of weeks, so a bit over a week from now, to know whether outbreaks have occurred as a result of these protests, and of course there are more coming up, so that pushes out the timeline and that complicates the whole issue of lifting restrictions. Hopefully there won't be more cases, or if there are, they'll be very limited, but nevertheless the medical experts are somewhat cautious and somewhat concerned. There's also another question, and that is that the community has accepted restrictions remarkably well, really. But now you find people saying, well, you know, we can't have large gatherings yet, we can't go to football matches in huge numbers. Why are these people able to protest? And so it does weaken the case for the restrictions that are remaining. Now, we are coming out of these restrictions and larger gatherings are being permitted almost on a weekly by weekly basis. But nevertheless, I think it does weaken the authority of leaders and indeed the health experts to carry the message.
The Prime Minister did use very strong language this week and said that protesters should be arrested if they do join future protests. Is that type of inflammatory language helpful though at this time?
Well, I think the police, of course, in New South Wales in particular, are saying that they will give protesters infringement notices, and they went to court and on Thursday got a judgment that the protest organised by refugee advocates shouldn't go ahead. So to that extent he's on song with the police, but I think that the less inflammatory his language is, the better. Leave it to the authorities to make the argument and try to take preventative action. And also he ends up in all sorts of byways which are very unhelpful. For example, he said in passing the other day that Australia had never had slavery, and immediately, of course, there was a reaction pointing out about Aboriginal people who were forcibly removed, and also, of course, labour that was brought in from elsewhere for the sugar cane farms and so on. And so this is divisive and I think unhelpful, including to the Prime Minister's cause.
Yes, I mean, does it play into this sort of presentation of protesters as being this sort of the anti-far, like the the extreme left in America, this sort of this partisan presentation of these protests? I mean, that type of language, does that feed into that presentation of the protests here?
Well, I think it does. Although the government has tried to say we recognise the cause that many of these protesters are highlighting, and that is incarceration of indigenous people and the deaths that have been in custody, but it sometimes veers off course and lurches into this language that really is counterproductive and quite wrong in some cases.
Okay, so you mentioned the high incarceration rates, and that's one of the focuses of the protests. What is being done to address this?
I think one of the disappointing things about this debate this week has been the fact that it has sort of gone off course rather than concentrating on what should be done. Now, this is a very difficult issue, obviously what political scientists would call a wicked problem, and it has many causes. But there are things being done, and there are new closing the gap targets being discussed, negotiated by governments and indigenous representatives. A new agreement is close to being concluded, and this may be helpful. This may well represent a serious new commitment by federal and state governments to attacking this problem. But it is going to take a lot of effort. Things have been attempted in the past, but they've obviously been totally inadequate. Much more action is needed, and I think much more working together by Indigenous leaders, by Indigenous communities. It's not going to be solved except by involving the community level of Indigenous people, and much more effort by federal and state governments.
So you said that there's an agreement in train. Any hint at when that might be delivered?
I think it's pretty close. The negotiations, as I understand it, are still going on, but there will be some report soon to the new federalism structure that has been announced by the Prime Minister recently, which of course is topped by the National Cabinet.
So National Cabinet's meeting again today, and border restrictions, I understand, are going to be one of the items on the agenda. Why are some states still resisting opening up their borders?
I think a mixture of motives, but primarily because New South Wales and Victoria have had the most cases. They're still risky areas. A place like Western Australia really feels that it doesn't lose out by being isolated. It wouldn't be getting a lot of tourism at this time from the east. It's encouraging people to tour within its state. And of course, it's always felt, well, we'd be better off on our own anyway. Long tradition of that sentiment in that state. The place where it's the issue is most difficult is Queensland. Now, the Palaszczuk government, of course, is coming up to an election there in October. So far, the polling shows that people are pretty happy with the border being closed, but there's a great deal of pressure from the federal government, from the New South Wales government, for that border to be open so that tourism can really get started. And while at one stage the Queenslanders were talking about keeping the border closed as late as September, now they're talking about July, and Scott Morrison is pressing them to actually put a date on this so people can make bookings, airlines can prepare, and so on.
I mean, it's a very fine calculation for the Queensland Premier, I guess, isn't it? Following the health advice, not wanting to carry deaths to the election,
That's right. That's right.
but having to carry the economic impact. I mean, it is a fine calculation.
And the health advice differs. The National Advisory Committee, which comprises the federal and the state health officers, say there's no reason for the borders to be closed, and yet the local Queensland health advice, the Queensland health officer, has been in favour of closing the borders, even though she's on the national body. So go figure that. When you ask, they say, well, the national body's a consensus body.
So New Zealand is also pressing to open up the international border between Australia and New Zealand, and they're COVID-free, apparently, the envy of the world. What's the likelihood, do you think, of this trans-Tasman bubble opening up?
I think it will come eventually. I think the New Zealanders are still a little doubtful about it because of the number of Australian cases. There's been talk of the border opening between one state and New Zealand, for example, Tasmania. But I think that New Zealand will be the first country that we have an open border with, and that will probably be achieved in a matter of months, but there's still caution at the moment.
Okay, so back in Parliament, the Prime Minister apologised for the robodebt scheme, and the impact that it's had on individuals, and people will be repaid. But it has come at a very high cost to individuals and families. I mean, how damaging has this been, and will it be, do you think, for the government?
I think it's something people will remember, and it's appalling that it got to that point, that it wasn't picked up much earlier. The government has said, well, this way of dealing with debt was well recognised. I think they argue it was even done by Labor, but clearly the whole ramping up of the scheme and the fact that it was automated, there weren't enough checks in it, ended up in a massive scandal, a very big lapse of good administration. And in terms of individuals, it meant that many totally innocent people were targeted, but also some of the most vulnerable people in the community were presented with inexplicable bills that simply didn't apply. Now, a lot of these people were really devastated by this, and deaths have been attributed to it. It really was a story of a government being incompetent, but also having no empathy, thinking the whole thing was to catch welfare cheats and assuming when numbers came up that this was a welfare cheat, rather than investigating whether this bill in fact applied or whether it had just been thrown up by a flawed system.
Yeah, that's right. So to the by-election in Eden Monaro, they've had the ballot draw.
More than a dozen candidates, some 14 candidates.
Well, that's right, and the Shooters Party's topped the list.
Hit the target.
That's right, and the Liberal candidates last. Any discussion about preference flows or the impact of the order of the ballot for the by-election?
Well, the impact obviously is against the Liberal candidate. How much this matters in the end, well, it depends how close the result is, of course. But I think this by-election is one that is very important for Anthony Albanese, really important for Labor to hold that seat. Otherwise, you'll hear sort of mutterings and underminings, not a leadership challenge, anything like that, but life will be even harder for Labor than it is at the moment, and it's pretty hard at the moment. They're having a lot of trouble getting cut through nationally. I think that the issues will, however, be very local, and the bushfire recovery issue does seem to be emerging quite strongly, with big differences of opinion about whether that recovery response has been adequate or not.
This morning there's been some evidence emerge of a misinformation campaign in the Eden Monaro by-election, some leaflets being distributed, etc., about false positions of Christy McBain, the Labor candidate, and it looks like it's quite a similar type of campaign that occurred during the Wentworth by-election. And I'm just wondering, do you think this is becoming more and more of a feature of Australian politics, these types of targeted misinformation campaigns?
Well, you get the impression that perhaps they are, and because material can be distributed so easily these days, and misinformation, that sort of facilitates campaigns being dirtier, but I think some dirtying campaigns has long been a feature of the system, probably always a feature of the system, but it needs to be cracked down on as quickly as possible, and those responsible need to be pursued as a deterrent as well as a punishment.
Thanks, Michelle, and speak to you in a fortnight.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.